Should we all come up here? Or
Yes,
for-
I was going to say,
Yeah,
Eric
yeah.
and Ann, would you like to come up so you're facing people? We want to have questions of all of you at this point. And there are microphones here that should be turned on.
I had to close the computer because the screensaver is my family vacation. I thought it was too personal.
It's good that you brought them up, because actually my question was, I think, a little bit about Ivan as well. So you talked a little bit about retractions and how there's not the resources from the Office of Research Integrity to police all of this stuff. Do you know if the Office of Research Integrity is looking at not just the retractions, but all of the publications that come out essentially kind of from statistical, like file report issues, where people do a certain, test for a number of times until they get a significant result. Because it seems to me like, from a researcher perspective, that there's a big stigma attached to retractions, and if you go trying to police this, it starts this kind of cat and mouse kind of game. But you could do something much more effective to promote people just doing more rigorous statistical analysis, or requiring disclosure of all your data, or something that would take away that negative connotation, but at the same time address that much larger problem of irreproducibility, as opposed to just that little tiny subset of actual fraud. It seems like fraud gets all the attention, but the other is a much more serious issue.
So my understanding, and it's a good question, is so I agree that there's a big problem with suboptimal use of statistics and experimental design and bias and so on. But I really do not think that that's in any way the mission of the Office of Research Integrity, which is really limited to fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. I also was interested to learn, a lot of people know this already, but the ORI really doesn't conduct very many investigations. They oversee institutional investigations. So I think the way the system is currently set up is that the institution has primary responsibility for conducting an investigation. And most institutions take this seriously and do a good job, but it's not consistent. And one of the issues is that institutions can have conflicts of interest. And so the way the current system is set up is not perfect. And the ORI can oversee that. And in the case of Ohio State, they said, we're not satisfied that there was enough attention to this, and we want you to go back and take a look at it. And after the institution took another look at it, they reached a misconduct finding in the case of Terry Elton, where originally it was a lot softer. And I think that the ORI working with institutions is very important for this, but it's really not going to address the much broader issue that you raise, which has to have some completely independent mechanism, I think, to address.
Barbara?
So I wanted to go back to this 6-year statute of limitations. Paradoxically, the reason that this really that it became necessary, and I didn't even know there was a 6-year statute of limitations until it came up with some policy talk. Someone from the FDA was talking about fraud and said, well, NIH doesn't know that. Paradoxically, it was because of Claire Francis, because we were getting inundated with emails about papers that were 10 and 15 years old. And we simply, the editors were flipping out because you couldn't always tell from the emails whether this is something that could be dismissed, but it's tremendously time consuming. And then, so what? So now you find something in a 12-year-old paper. All those authors have now scattered to other places. If the PI is still there, he or she does not have the original data, you can't really get an investigation. But I did want to clarify, because it turns out that we know somebody at ORI who explained to us that it's not so cut and dry. And I think we in ASM have the same philosophy, which is if it's the first complaint and it's about a 15-year-old paper, we're probably not going to investigate it unless it's so blatant and so obvious that there has to be some kind of expression of concern. However, if there's been, and ORI is the same way, if there's a pattern of abuse, there's no statute of limitation. So if something comes up and it triggers a concern, we will go to the university and say, this is very serious. We know we've already published 10 papers from this guy. We now have serious doubts about this. We think you need to investigate the research performance. I think the key thing to keep in mind is that publishers are not investigators either. And publishers don't talk to ORI either about research. It's really the responsibility of the universities. So that we really have to rely on them doing their job. And in the case of some of these multiple offenders, especially in Japan, I mean, it's a huge national scandal now. They're going through absolutely everything, for example, for Cato, everything he's ever published, and the committee is coming back to us and saying, well, this one looks okay, and this one we think there's maybe a problem, but we'll get back to you. We don't know for sure. That's going to take years, probably, to sort this out. So I think when there's a first complaint, and there has to be some line in the sand so that we don't spend all our time reanalyzing old work that presumably has already been noted as irreproducible or as not important.
Well, like Gregor Mendel's anomalies in his P research, for example, or Millikan's oil drop experiment, where he dropped out certain data points. I don't think we have to go there with retracting those papers, but it's an interesting discussion. But I think, as people involved in journals, we also really want the literature to be as valid as possible. So I agree completely, and not just because you're my boss, that if there's really clear-cut evidence that there's a flawed paper out there, it doesn't matter how old it is, we want to clean it up. But there's also a practical limitation, really, in just what can be done historically. And I think that this is a good middle ground.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think where Adam and I sort of wonder is the sort of where there's no reason given for not looking into it. In other words, if it says, look, this is that is a perfectly sound walkthrough. It's the editors who sort of say, we're just not going to look at this because it's anonymous. We're not going to look at this because it's old, even if we know that there are other cases that involve the same person. I mean, you don't want to profile people. But I do want to get back actually to this point about that you both mentioned about institutional investigations. Adam and I are incredibly frustrated with the state of most investigations. I'm not sure we'd agree that most do a good job. And if most are doing a good job, enough of them aren't telling us what they're actually doing that I have to trust but verify. I think that's a problem. Adam and I think that's a problem. ORI is certainly and people in the U.S. actually get say, oh, the ORI doesn't have enough resources. It can only investigate or supervise a certain number of investigations, and that's all true. But no other country really has anything. I mean, there are some commissions that are set up to do similar things. So if anything, ORI is sort of doing more than many other places. I think it's something that the community needs to take a look at because too many, even with the Elton case, I mean, there's a case where, again, ORI said, we're not satisfied with your investigation. They went back, they did another investigation, said, yes, there was misconduct. Terry Elton still has his full professorship and, has a ban, not a ban on funding, but supervised funding and things like that for a few years. Given all of the competition we've seen for grants and things, the idea that someone who had been clearly found to have had misconduct is then not really disciplined by the university, I'm not saying he should have been or not, but I didn't see any explanation for why he wasn't. And so I do think we need to look at that issue.
It's not even,
Sorry.
but it's not even that they're not being censored by the institution, but they're not being censored by the broader academic community either, because these papers continue to rack up citations year after year, especially the ones that don't have any indication that, hey, this has been retracted for the following reasons. They're in the Amgen studies that Glenn Begley did, some of those papers that were found irreproducible, we don't even talk about front, they've got, thousands of citations and continue to accrue them.
Well, there is a difficulty with confidentiality. So with the Bayer study and the Amgen study, we don't know what those papers are. We don't know what experiments were done. They're not published. So this is a problem, and a lot of institutional investigations are confidential. They're not published. It's the rare institution that makes, that releases all of this information publicly. So I agree. It's very problematic to go and figure out what happened. And even when Dr. Mori had 31 retracted papers, he was fired by his university. He sued and got his job back, and he's back publishing papers now in alternative medicine instead of cancer research.
Okay, we
Keep an eye out
have
for those.
a question over here, and then one over here.
I'm not quite sure who addresses it, but do you think institutions have a financial disincentive for finding fraud? For example, it tends to be, if you think about it, people who commit fraud tend to be very prolific. And the more prolific you are, probably the more funding you receive, right? So the more funding you receive, the more funding they have to lose if someone is found guilty.
They have lots of conflicts of interest, both directions. They have reasons to make a scapegoat of an individual and not the institutional environment, and they also have reasons to protect individuals who bring in lots of money. And yet they're the organization best suited to carry on an investigation. It may take years. They have to review all the primary data. They have to interview everybody. It's clearly not something that a journal or a publisher can do. And the government does come in and touch base with the investigation when it's an ORI-involved case. But the NSF, has its own mechanism through the Office of the Inspector General, and those reports are actually not very informative. They don't identify the people who are involved. They say an investigator at a university had done this. So there's even disagreement in terms of the government approach depending on what branch of science you're in if you're investigated for misconduct. So it is a haphazard system, and it could be improved, but there are inherent conflicts of interest that I don't think are easily dissected out.
Well, I mean, I would completely agree with that. I would also, and it's not reasonable to expect journals and publishers to do these kinds of investigations. That being said, I think journals and publishers have a tremendous amount of power that they often, let's just say, sometimes don't wield as effectively as they could. And so if you look at someone like Steve Schaefer, who's editor of Anesthesia and Analgesia, Steve took everything to the mat. He took it to the mat in 3 cases, well, probably more, but 3 big cases involving, obviously, anesthesia. Scott Rubin, who eventually served prison time, Joaquin Bolt, who was the reigning retraction king until he was overturned by the 3rd case that Steve really shepherded, Yoshitaka Fuji, who now is it looks like, going to have to retract 183 papers. And the reason why all those happened the way they did, and why they actually happened relatively quickly once things started moving, was that Steve, published editorials and said, we are holding the institutions accountable, made it everything public, put out press releases, and, really sort of, again, went to the mat and was willing to really push and use the power he had as an editor of a leading journal, where everybody wanted to publish, to say, we're not going to tolerate this. And of course, the flip side of that is now it looks like anesthesia has a problem. Adam and I argue anesthesia is probably the most trustworthy field at this point, because the fact that it has the most retractions means somebody's actually paying attention. That can be debated too.
Question over here.
This question relates to Ivan's topic. I'd be curious if anyone has thoughts on this issue. We recently identified a case during the peer review process of an author that provided a fake email address for a suggested reviewer. We were able to find that because they weren't so clever about the email address, and it actually resembled the author's name more than the name of the reviewer they suggested. But it's scary to think about that practice. It's this person that you mentioned was found because of when the reviews were coming in. It's hard to track that. We're looking into IP-based methods to see if maybe we can track if things are coming from the same institution where they say they're not. But there's a lot of resistance to the idea of requiring institutional email addresses or not allowing suggested reviewers. And so, given any really dramatic changes to the way that system works, to allow suggested reviewers, do you have any suggestions about how we can try to identify these things? Because if someone is clever,
I would recommend that you have a database that you've assembled yourself of trusted reviewers. That's your primary resource for reviewers. That's the system that I'm used to. It has been studied with regard to reviewers that are recommended by authors versus reviewers who are chosen on the basis of their expertise by the editors. And clearly the reviews in that study that was done, I think it might have been Michael Callahan, but I'm not sure, were more positive. If you recommend people, they're more likely to be people who are favorably disposed to the work. Oftentimes, it's because the author has already discussed the work and knows that person likes it. It's not necessarily nefarious. People are going to want to recommend reviewers who are supportive, but you have to then be skeptical as an editor and say, I might choose one of the reviewers that's recommended, and I might choose two other reviewers that I know and trust from my database. And that will, I think, prevent there from being too much of an influence, even if the author is clever and puts up a lot of different sham reviewers with sham email addresses. At the most, it's going to be every reviewer so that could possibly be like that. And I, as an editor, I always look at the recommended reviewers and see whether they have any relevant expertise. And when I see that the reviewers have no relevant expertise, I ignore those recommendations entirely. You're by no means obligated to use them. Barb?
Do you see that as an ethical violation?
I do see it as an ethical violation. And I see that if an author commits a clear-cut ethical violation according to the guidelines of your particular journal, then I think that the journals can play a powerful role by informing the institution of a concern. Now, when that happens, some institutions don't take it very seriously, but in my experience, most of them, and the good ones, do. And this has repercussions. Otherwise, they'll just do it again. They'll shop to another journal. They'll play the same games. I think that we don't want to be taking miscreants and their misbehavior and simply saying, well, at least they're not in our journal, thank God, and then send it to the next journal. I think we have to do something that is going to be a powerful disincentive, a deterrent to this kind of behavior.
And I was
I'll just say
gonna
briefly, there's
oh.
also, I'm sorry, there's also Orchid, right? I mean, that's actually all I had to say about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're not any different. We recently, gosh, in the last 6 months, sent a communication out to all of our editors sharing an incident that had happened, not in our journals, but something that had been published in I believe it was the Chronicle of Higher Education, where they had exactly that same thing. And we're recommending to our editors just exactly what Farrick said. If you can't verify who that is, then we recommend that you don't use it. And I've had any number of editors say to me, I don't even know why we collect those, because they're not very good anyway, because they always ask somebody to do that. But it really is a problem. And we were just sort of talking about that we are very hopeful that Orchid is going to help control some of this anyway. But the best advice we've been able to give to our office is you just got to be vigilant. You really have to take a moment and investigate it and take a look at it. And if you don't know who they are, you can't verify that that email address, then find somebody else. Take that extra time.
Right, and sometimes even the institution, for people on my staff were saying, well, if they have an institutional email address, they're sending us. But that doesn't necessarily work either, because some institutions do allow 2 to 3 email addresses for a faculty person, so you could easily put in your own fake institutional,
Well, I said to say
and
the
it'd probably be your own institution, which should be caught, but still.
The one that we got embarrassed about was a scientist who had an unusual name, and then they had their maiden name as a reviewer on a paper that they'd offered, and we got caught and didn't realize it till after something had happened, and it happened through 2 or 3 of them, and then we realized what was happening. It never occurred to us to think about that sort of twist until after it happened.
Yeah. Back in the corner.
We hear the phrase, trust but verify a lot, right? And everyone generally agrees with that. But the big question, of course, is what does verify mean? And the decisions that publishers make in terms of how many levels of verification, how many resources are put towards verification. So I think the way the system works is there is an underlying trust, and if somebody at the end of the day really does want to game the system, they can. I guess my question is, where do you think we are or should be in regards to the emphasis of verification versus trust?
Well, well, as I say, I think if I think of the activities that are happening at the American Chemical Society, it makes me sort of think that we're moving towards where we feel like we need to have more verification. So we have instituted more programs in the last couple of years to be able to verify than we had before. Now, in all honesty, some of that could be because we're becoming more knowledgeable. You know, we've been very, become involved in COPE. We're learning from them. We're listening to the stories. I mean, we're working on a better process about identifying retractions right now to make sure that it's clear and things like that. And so maybe we're becoming more vigilant about wanting to verify because we're watching what's happening in the community. But, I would say that we're kind of leaning towards feeling like we need to verify.
I think the balance, though, in science is still very much on the side of trust, because if it were not, we would be demanding primary source data on every paper, and we don't do that. And I think that the danger with a system that is really most reliant on verification is there will be an arms race, and people will outsmart the verification systems. I still marvel at the cases we do know of misconduct, how easily they can be demonstrated, and that people are really not very competent at the way they're committing misconduct, at least the cases that have been caught. And maybe the people who are better at it haven't been caught. But, to take pieces of photomicrographs and then to use other versions of that flipped around in the same paper, is just inviting some of these amateur sleuths to come in and pick this up. It's a little more artful to duplicate images across different papers and different journals over different periods of time. But why duplicate it all? Surely somebody's lab notebook is so full of figures that you could just find random figures that have never been published, and this would be untraceable. So I think that there's an intrinsic trust that's inherent in science, and we actually don't want to move away from that. And we have to accept that's the way science is done. Most scientists are honorable. Most scientific data are valid, and yet these examples of bad science pollute and threaten the whole enterprise. And so we have to pay attention to them, but I don't think we should become overly cynical about the way science is
I
done.
ask the questions, I do a lot of media relations and have these conversations with reporters all the time. And we in the science community understand that what you said. The investigative reporters for the New York Times or something, they generally don't. Their expectation that publishers and institutions should weigh almost entirely on the verification side as opposed to the trust side. And I find myself having that explanation. At the end of the day, we have to trust scientists, and a lot of reporters say, well, that's not enough.
Well, I think it's not enough probably because, and I don't necessarily say that publishers have done this, it's not enough because of the sort of press release life that we all live now. And I think the media is responsible for some of this, but I also think institutions, and by that I don't really just mean publishers. If anything, the press releases I get from publishers are the most sort of sane and straightforward. The ones I get from some institutions make me wonder why they're allowed to give out degrees, certainly in communications. But, when you sort of look, the vaccine manufacturers had this problem when they basically promised everyone in the 50s that polio vaccine was entirely safe. Well, on balance, it's very, 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 very safe. But there were going to be some side effects, and obviously some quite tragic ones, especially given some of the early vaccines. And so once you sort of set the expectation as, we can trust it completely, or, this is kosher, this is legit, this is totally checked out. That's part of the story that Adam and I are trying to tell is, okay, let's just be honest about what peer review does, what it can accomplish, what we can honestly do with it. And then and again, I blame journalists as much as I blame anyone putting out a press release. If you read some of the sort of overblown stories that, some of my competitors do, I want to tear what's left of my hair out. But I think it's a setting expectations thing, and maybe that's not an easy thing to do, but it's something we can all do.
And I think that's a good note at which to stop here. Our time is up. it's setting, and we have to set expectations for ourselves, it's all the journal editors here, to just do the best we can to thwart efforts to get around, to erode trust in science. But thank you all for coming. Thank you for all of our speakers, and we'll see you all at the O'Reilly Talk.